Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from OnlinePhotographyTraining.com. Welcome to my free training on Alien Skin Exposure X4. Please remember to share this video, like this video, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. In this episode, I'm going to demonstrate how you should sharpen and reduce noise in your images using Exposure X4. Now, we're going to start out with this demonstration by showing you the effect sharpening and noise reduction has on gray bars. I think you'll see once we're done with the gray bars that it really demonstrates exactly what each of these sliders do. Now, to demonstrate, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So I'm going to hit Command plus a few times and drag it over towards this transition zone. I'm going to even hit Command plus another time there. If you have a PC, you'd hit Control plus to zoom in. Now, to start off, I want to talk about clarity for a second. So we're going to jump up to the Basic tab. And you probably know that when you increase clarity on your image, it kind of gives that effect that you're sharpening the image. And what happens when you move clarity to the right, you'll notice, is not only are we kind of like enhancing the artifacts that are in this JPEG file, but you could see that the darker gray right at the transition zone gets a little darker, and the lighter gray right at that transition zone gets a little lighter. So wherever there are edges or transitions in an image, it adds contrast to that edge. It makes the darker a little darker and the lighter a little lighter. And you'll find actually that sharpening in the Detail tab does pretty much the same thing. It's just a little bit more refined and you have a little bit more control. Now, looking at this same transition zone, now you can see there's a lot of JPEG artifacts in there, and that's going to help us when we get to the noise reduction part of this tab. But look at this transition zone right there. When I take this amount slider to the right, it makes the darker gray a little darker and the lighter gray a little lighter. That's really all sharpening is. You're adding contrast to a very specific part of the image, and that's the transition areas, wherever light meets dark. And you're just making the lighter a little lighter and the darker a little darker. Now I'm going to leave that at the maximum amount, 150. So we have this maximum amount of sharpening. So this darker gray is as dark as it will be. The lighter gray is as light as it will be when the amount slider is at 150. Well, what does radius do? Now, as I move that to the right, it looks like the dark is getting even darker and the light is getting even lighter. And it is, but it's also moving away from the edge. So it's increasing the radius or the number of pixels that are affected. So it's not only making the dark a little darker and the light a little lighter, it's moving out from the edge a little more. And as I bring radius down towards 0.5, you can see it's minimal. We probably even need to zoom in even more to see the effect. So radius comes out and really kind of spreads it out. So in a real world situation, which we'll work on in a moment, when you're sharpening, you would bring sharpening up till it looks sharp, and then you would move that radius slider left or right a little bit just to see, because you're actually enhancing the sharpening, and you just want to see if maybe a little wider of a radius helps the sharpening, or a little more narrow of a radius will help the sharpening. Now the detail slider is more subtle. It's really like the amount slider, but it's a little more subtle. It's not going to be as dramatic, but you can see that kind of pushes the radius out even further, right? So I'm at the far left, we're as narrow as we could be, and when we go to the right, you could see it kind of narrows it out, or widens it out, I'm sorry. But one thing I want you to really notice is we're enhancing the artifacts as well. All this banding is way more noticeable. And that's one of the things that you have to be careful of when you sharpen an image. Any noise in your image is going to get enhanced. And whenever you enhance the noise, it's actually a little harder to get rid of. Now, masking just kind of applies the sharpening more to the edges, and you could control how much you want it to go to the edges. Because right now, I have amount, radius, and detail at their maximum amounts, and they're affecting every single pixel in the image. So in a real world situation, if let's say you're a landscape shooter and you took a shot and it has an expansive blue sky, what you'll find is in your blue sky, you'll have a lot of noise that you enhanced. Well, you could mask it away from the blue sky, so it really only affects the transition zone, those edges. And with the masking slider, as you move that to the right, you could see how the banding, these artifacts over here, are becoming lessened as I move that to the right. And we'll do this in a real world situation. I'll show you how to precisely adjust the masking on an image. Now, as far as noise reduction is concerned, we actually have two different types of noise reduction in Exposure X4. The first is luminance noise, and they call it brightness, but it's more commonly called luminance noise. And this is the common noise you would get with any digital camera. Just kind of looks like film grain. And as you move this brightness slider to the right, you'll see those artifacts smooth out, especially like these darker ones over here and the lighter one over here. You'll see as I move that to the right, it smooths that right out. Now, what you may find is when you sharpen an image, then apply some noise reduction, the noise reduction, the brightness slider of the noise reduction, maybe will soften the image a little bit too much. So you'll go back up and you'll add more amount, sharpening, or you'll play with the radius and detail sliders, but then you're enhancing the noise again. What you could do is this detail slider, if you move this to the right, you're going to very subtly add sharpening. Even though it's in the noise reduction section, what you're doing is you're rescuing detail. So if we move this to the right, and it's very subtle, as I mentioned, if you look right here, this little artifact transition area right there, you can see it's becoming more defined. So as I move this detail slider that's in the noise reduction section, not the detail slider that's in the sharpening section, this detail slider, it kind of brings back some of that detail. If you move it to the left, it's going to really soften the image a little more. It's going to just help you reduce noise a little more. Now, the other type of noise reduction is color noise, and there is no color noise in this image, so I'm going to demonstrate that in another image in a moment. So hopefully these gray bars kind of give you the idea what each of these sliders do. Now let's see if we could really apply them to a real world situation. We have this image here. I'm going to zoom out for a minute so you could see it. This is obviously a gorilla, and this is an image that I'd like to sharpen. Now typically what I like to do is I like to zoom in when I sharpen and reduce noise in an image. And what I'll do is I'll zoom in to like a 1:1. And if you go over here on the left navigator panel, if you click on 1:1, you'll see that it's zoomed in quite a bit. Then I'll drag it around so that I see where I want detail. And I, of course, want detail in the gorilla's eyes. But I also could see the noise. And there's actually going to be quite a bit of noise in the background. And you can see there's a lot of noise there. So, usually what most photographers recommend is when you do sharpening and noise reduction is that you reduce noise first, because it's harder to get rid of the noise if you sharpen first. With Exposure X4, that's not as important because this panel, everything is self-contained, and these kind of work together and play off one another. So it really doesn't matter if you sharpen or reduce noise first if you're doing it all in Exposure X4. But if you're using external programs like plugins to reduce noise and sharpen your image, definitely reduce noise very early in your workflow and sharpen very late in your workflow. Even the last thing you do before you export, you would sharpen. But in this case, as I mentioned, with Exposure X4, these are together, and they play off one another. What I would recommend you do is if you have a workflow that is all contained in Exposure X4 is that you do the basic adjustments first, then you do noise reduction in the Detail tab, then do any other adjustments down here, and then right before you're ready to export it, then do sharpening. And you may have to readjust noise reduction when you do that. So I'm going to reduce noise first. It's just the habit of the way I like to do it. And you could see actually there is some color noise over here in the background. Color noise will typically be just red, blue, or green dots, very small. And if I even zoom in a little more, you may be more apt to see it over in here. So these little red, green, and blue dots. So we'll go with that first. Now what you'll find with the color and smooth sliders that are in this section of the noise reduction tab is that it's very easy to go too far. And if you go too far, you're actually going to start affecting the color of the entire image. For example, if I look at this gorilla's eyes, and if I move the color slider all the way to the right, after it renders, you could see I sucked out some of the color in her eyes. And if I go to the smooth slider and move that to the right, you could see it further kind of affects the color. Like look right in here in her eye. So you need to be careful with these two sliders. I strongly recommend that you rarely move the color slider over 25-30. I found that that's kind of the sweet spot. And in most instances, if you move it just to start with, right around 25, what you'll see is the grain look will still be there. But the colors, the red, blue, green, sometimes little purple dots and little magenta dots, you'll find that that color is kind of sucked away. Then what you do is you come in with the smooth slider and you move that to the right. And then it will kind of smooth out a little bit of that, that grainy look. Now it's not meant to totally eliminate that kind of grainy look. That's what the noise reduction brightness slider is for. And again, this is really luminance noise reduction. So you move that to the right and let it render. And you could see, I'll go all the way and you could see once it renders, see how it really smoothed it out. But not only did it smooth it out, it kind of blurred the image too. I'm going to turn this entire Detail tab off by clicking the on-off switch. And look like right in here, and you could see that it really took away some of the detail in our gorilla. So you need to be very careful. Now what I suggest you do, here let's reset this whole thing, is I would start with the brightness first, the luminance noise first, and not worry about the color yet, because a lot of times the color gets kind of corrected a little bit with the luminance noise. So what I do typically is I'll move this right to the middle. So I'll move it to around 50 and I'll look at the image, and I'm zoomed in a little bit too much for what I normally would do. So I'd go 1-to-1 like right here. This usually gives you a nice view. So there's before the 50 adjustment. Let it render. Okay, you could see there's quite a bit of noise there. And after, and you could see it smoothed it out decently. I think it probably could go a little higher, but what I would then do before I go any higher with this, because there is color noise in there, I would take the color slider and I'll move it up to 25. Like I mentioned, I found 25 to kind of be the sweet spot. Now it seems to have kind of sucked out the little color dots, but it really kind of enhanced the noise a little bit. So it kind of added a little bit of the luminance noise back. So I'm going to go to the smooth slider and I'll move that to the right. And I'll move that right in the middle, usually somewhere around 50. And take a look at that. So this is kind of a give and take. You're going to add a little, take a little away, and bounce around. So now I have brightness and detail at 50, color and smooth at 25 and 50. So I'll jump back up here to the brightness. And now I just think I want to take away a little more of that noise. So I'm going to move it up to 75. And look at it. And I think actually that looks pretty good. Now if it went too far, then I would split the difference between 50 and 75. And I'd do something around 62, right? So something in the middle. So I kind of will narrow in and kind of drill down to the perfect adjustment. Now, if I felt that the sharpening was affected, I could move the detail slider to the right, but I may come back to that. Now let's add some actual sharpening to the image. So what I typically do again is I'll just take the sharpening slider and move it in the middle. Now this goes to 150, so the middle is 75, so I'll be somewhere around 75, in this case 74. And I'll look at the sharpening. I particularly want to look at the gorilla's eyes. And what I'll often do is I'll bring it back down. Takes a second to render, and then bring it back up and look at it. And actually that looks pretty good. Then what I'll often do is I'll go back to fit, and then I'll turn this entire tab off and on. Now you probably could notice very quickly, look at the gorilla's eyes. There is on. There is off. That's where I mentioned this color section really does affect the color of your image. So if I take that back down, let it render, smooth down, let it render, you can see it brought a little bit of the color back. But I think the luminance noise reduction is affecting it too. Let's bring that down. Yeah, see, that did affect it a little bit. So what you'll have to do is go back in the basic tab and dial in a little more saturation. So we're going to leave that at, I think I had that at 75, right? We'll leave it there. And actually, I think that looks pretty good. Now, what I could do now is I could zoom back in. We'll go back up here to 1:1. And again, look around here. And I must say that I really fuss over sharpening and noise reduction, as you could see. So I spend a lot of time on this tab because I really want to make sure that I didn't over sharpen the image or that noise is very distracting. And what I found, at least for me, and I think this is like this for many photographers, is my eyes, not that they become fatigued, but they become kind of numb to what I'm looking at. And I'll tend to over sharpen the image. So what I found is I'll do these adjustments, then I'll walk away for a while from my computer and let my eyes readjust to the real world. Then come back in and just look at the image. Usually my eyes need an hour rest. And I'll look at it, and right away it will hit me if I over sharpen the image or if the noise reduction is wrong or anything, and then I could micro adjust it from that point on. And I recommend you do the same. It's all too often I see some great scenes on Instagram that are just over sharpened. It's just because I think the photographer's eyes got numb to what they were doing. So I kind of like that. Now what I could do is I could come in with radius and I'll go to like extremes. You know, well, what's it look when it's way up? Now you can see it dialed in a lot of sharpening. It's taken a long time to render. So you can see it looks really sharp, right? But if I zoom back out, you know, that's way too sharp, way over sharpened, right? So I'll put that more in the middle and let it render. It didn't actually change much, so come even down a little more. And it still didn't really change too much. Bring it back down. Whatever the default was 1. I think that looked pretty good. Now, again, if I felt that the sharpening wasn't just quite enough, but if I kind of if I'm pushing a mount up and it's suddenly kind of like there's no happy medium, it goes from not sharp enough to too sharp, then I could come in with this detail slider and move that to the right. And that will, it's very subtle, but it will bring in some more detail to the image. And I could barely see it, and I would bet in the video you guys can't see it at all. On the other hand, if it's the other way, like it's either too sharp all the time, and then it's really not sharp at all, you could leave it at the too sharp side, and then take this detail slider and move it down. So you could kind of like soften it a bit to try to make it look more natural. I'm going to leave that in its default position. Now, as masking is concerned, I mentioned that masking kind of helps relegate the sharpening just to the edges, wherever there is a high contrast edge. When it's at 0, I'm sharpening every pixel in the image. Well, there's no need to sharpen this background, correct? So I could take masking to the right. But there's a little trick you could do to help you properly mask the sharpening. Hold the Alt or Option key, and it's Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac. Then click on the masking slider and start to move it. And when you do, you'll notice that your image turns into this black and white rendition. Wherever white is, that's what is getting the sharpening. Wherever black is, that's not getting any sharpening. So when I'm at 0, you'll see everything's white. Every pixel is getting sharpened. When I take masking all the way to the right, you can see most of the image is black. That means barely anything is getting sharpened. So what we want to do, I mainly want to sharpen the gorilla's eyes and like her cheeks, I guess, the area under her eyes, and some of her fur that's around her forehead and around her ears. And that looks like pretty good right there. And you'll notice that background now, that's all black back there. That's not getting sharpened at all. So then I'll let go of the mouse and the Alt or Option key, and you can see we're back to normal. So there it is. Now, there's a before, and there's an after. Now, it really did affect the eyes, and it did soften it a little bit. As I look at her eyes, let me zoom in a bit. If you look at her eyes, and I take it off, you can see that we're actually kind of wiped out a lot of detail in her eyes when I sharpen. So I could come in here with this noise reduction detail slider and move that to the right. Now we still have a tiny bit of color noise, and I want to be very careful with this. So I'm going to take that up and just move it up to 10 because it really does kind of suck the color out of the actual image itself, and I want to be careful with that. So I'm going to go back to fit, and then I'll see before and after. There's before, and there's after. Now overall, I think it softened the image just slightly, but I brought some of that sharpening back. I could come up in here and I could move radius more to the right. I think that really helped enhance sharpening. So there's before, and there's after. Now I would go back up to the basic tab and I would go saturation. I have it at 25 already. But if I wanted to kick that up a little more, or if I wanted to take vibrance up a little more, or alternately, if I wanted to get a brush and brush in some saturation to her eyes, I could do that. If I feel it's making the background a little bit, doing the global adjustments makes the background a little bit too colorful, I could use a brush. But you know, I don't need to do that for this episode. Now, I just want to demonstrate that color again because I want you to be really careful of it. And there's this image here. This was at a very high ISO, and it has a lot of color noise. So I'm going to go to 1:1. I'm going to zoom in because it is a crop, I think. I cropped in so you could better see the noise. So you can see there's a lot of color noise here. Hopefully you could see it, especially blue. A lot of blue dots in there. So we'll go to the Detail tab. And naturally, you would take this color slider and move it to the right. So you can see watch, now see those blue dots in there? I'll take this. Hopefully you can see it in the video. Just moving color up to 50. It took all that color out. So we still have that green noise, that kind of digital noise there, but the color is gone. But watch, you take smooth to the right. I want you to look at the duck's eye. See what I mean? That smooth really does affect the actual colors in the image. And that's why I think you really should be very careful with this color and smooth slider. So my recommendation is that you do the sharpening and noise reduction as mentioned. And if you find that the noise reduction is kind of sucking out a lot of color, use the brush and add some saturation back into your image with the brush. Or you could do the global adjustment. In this case, I think it's enhancing the background a little bit too much behind the gorilla, and I don't like that. I think it's distracting. I'd rather have this background not as colorful per se. So what I would do is I would go up to the basic tab. I might as well show you. We got time. And I would take vibrance back down, I would take saturation down a little bit. And then if I wanted to add, now I already have her iris enhanced up here, but just for this demonstration, I'm going to just do another brush, all right, just to show you. And what I'll do is on this brush, I'll do a thing here. I'll do saturation, and I'll come in and just dial in that way. So then I could go to this basic tab, and I could then adjust saturation to bring it back. And that way I'm not adversely affecting the background or anything else in the image that I don't want affected. So that's what I suggest you do. So again, I am probably the norm as far as professional photographers are concerned when it comes to the detail tabs in any application. We often spend a lot of time doing the sharpening and noise reduction because it is very important. It really could make your image pushed over the top. You know, it really could make it pop, and you should spend a lot of time with it and not just, you know, go to some formula that someone says, you know, take detail to 75 and sharp or noise reduction to 40, you know, something like that. Don't do that. Really, every image is different. So that's my recommendation. Spend a lot of time with the detail tab. Hopefully you'll understand better what each of these sliders do. Also, I might want to add, it may help you sharpen your image if you hold that Alt or Option key in and then adjust some of the sliders. You'll notice it took a second, but how it turned into a monochrome image. Some photographers thinks this helps them sharpen the image when the image is black and white. Personally, I don't find that, but a lot of photographers believe that. So you just let go of the Alt or Option key and it will come back to color. So hold the Alt or Option key in, click on the slider, and now in this case we got this kind of real gray thing, and this allows you to better see the radius adjustment. Remember with the gray bars, that's the amount outside from that transition edge that's getting affected. The more you move the radius slider to the right, the wider that area will be affected. And same thing with detail. You hold that Alt or Option key in and then adjust. And sometimes it takes a second. And I don't think, maybe detail doesn't have the adjustment. I don't remember. But anyways, you could experiment with the holding the Alt or Option key. And again, it's Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac, and adjust these sliders. And hopefully it will help you properly sharpen and reduce noise in your image. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and share this video, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, visit my website, onlinephotographytraining.com. There you'll find thousands of totally free videos and articles to help you with your photography.